So now I'm going to tell you two constitutions. So I'm going to tell you a story of two constitutions. So the way this is going to go, the structure of this, I put my cards on the table. I'm going to tell you some history of the United States at the beginning of our republic, the beginnings, two beginnings, because we had a false one, and tell you some stories about it, and then you're supposed to think about Europe. So the United States began as a country with a big tax revolt, or tax riot, as Basetto and Phelan would call it. Big tax revolt. We revolted against Great Britain. 13 colonies of Britain declared themselves as 13 independent countries. They formed a very weak union called a confederacy. They wrote a constitution that they ultimately ratified in 1781. It was called the Articles of Confederation. It governed the United States from 1781 to 1789. I would say that this Constitution was Ronald Reagan's dream, to do a caricature. It's a Constitution that is devised to starve the beast. You ever heard that expression? It's designed to create a central government that can't tax, spend, or borrow. It can't borrow because it can't tax. So here's the way the Constitution worked. There's 13 states. They're sovereign states. They're fiscally sovereign. The 13 states have control over, first, the ability to regulate their foreign trade. So they impose trade regulations. That means New York, Georgia, the Carolinas. They all have their independent trade policies decided by the state legislatures in those countries. The individual states have the ability to raise the most important tax in those days. The most important tax is a tariff, because this is really poor countries, 13 really poor countries. The tariff, there's 13 different tariff policies. There's a central government that consists of, it's a Congress. It has no executive. It's called the Continental Congress. It has no power to tax. It can solicit, it can request that the 13 governments contribute tax revenues to the center, but it has no power to enforce them. This concerned James Madison immensely. In addition, I've got to tell you about some initial conditions. The United States financed the war against Great Britain using desperate means. The 13 state governments all issued their own money. They were called bills of credit. They all also borrowed. You have 13 governments borrowing. In addition, the federal government borrows. The central government, the Continental Congress, borrows. So at the by the end of the war in 1781 or 82, we'd printed, the central government issued money too, called Continentals. They depreciated. The central government had issued debt that was, if it had been valued at par, and it was, by the way, denominated in dollars. In these days, during the Revolution and in the 1780s, the United States is in a currency union with Spain. The currency is a Spanish dollar. Spain didn't care about this at all. We're using the Spanish dollar, but Spain's not going to guarantee, they're not going to bail us out. So we end the war with immense debts. If they were valued at par, they would be on the order of 40 or 50% of GDP. This is a really poor country, so that's a really, really high debt GDP ratio. But they weren't valued at par. They're going at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. So the story of the 1780s is you could see an equilibrium. There's people, honorable people, across, Thomas Jefferson, our founders, our framers. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they all want the United States to pay its debts. So what they do is they try to get the Continental Congress to raise revenues. And So lots of times Congress will pass an act asking states to contribute to revenues, and the states won't do it. There are efforts to amend the Articles of Confederation to raise more taxes. They're always defeated. So in the 1780s, the United States situation has got a weak center. It's got federal government debt and state debt going at deep discount. And now the question is this a fiscal crisis? Well, I said there's winners and losers. So it all depends on who you ask. If you ask the creditors of the U.S. government, most of whom are domestic, about 12% of the government debt is owned abroad, and about 80%, 100 minus 12, whatever that is, that's owned domestically. About 1/3 of the debt was issued by the individual states, the 13, and 2/3 by the federal government. These are Alexander Hamilton's numbers. And the debt's going at deep discount. So is there a crisis? Well, it depends. If you're a creditor of the U.S. government, there's a crisis. If you're a taxpayer, there's not a crisis. The equilibrium's working just like it was designed. Talk about mechanism design. This is a mechanism designed to constrain the central government, and it worked. So it didn't matter. So the way I read this is an equilibrium is an equilibrium. The government surplus process that came from this was going to be one that had low government surpluses. It wasn't going to be sufficient to support the debt, and that's life. That's an equilibrium. That's the way it's set up. So it didn't matter whether Alexander Hamilton or James Madison gave some big speech about the government budget constraint and the virtues of paying your debt. This system was not going to fund that debt.